Here Be Dragons by Sharon Penman. Chapter 1. July 1183, Shropshire, England. He was 10 years old and an alien in unfriendly land, made an unwilling exile by his mother's marriage to a Marcher border lord. His new stepfather seemed a kindly man, but he was not of Llewelyn's blood, not one of the Cymry, and each dawning day in Shropshire only intensified Llewelyn's heartsick longing for his homeland. For his mother's sake, he did his best to adapt to the strangeness of English ways. He even tried to forget the atrocity stories that were so much a part of his heritage, tales of English conquest and cruelties. His was a secret sorrow he shared with no one, for he was too young to know that misery repressed is misery all the more likely to fester. It was on Saturday morning, a fortnight after his arrival at Cowes Castle, that Llewelyn mounted his gelding and rode north, towards the little village of Westbury. He had not intended to go any farther, but he was bored and lonely, and the road beckoned him on. 10 miles to the east lay the town of Shrewsbury, and Llewelyn had never seen a town. He hesitated, but not for long. His stepfather had told him there were 5 villages between Westbury and Shrewsbury, and he recited them under his breath as he rode: Whitton, Stony Stretton, Yokethal, Newnham, and Crookton. If he kept careful count as he passed through each one, there'd be no chance of getting lost, and with luck, he'd be back before his mother even realized he was gone. Accustomed to forest trails and deer tracks, he found it strange to be travelling along a road wide enough for several horsemen to ride abreast. Stranger still to him were the villages, each with its green and market cross, its surprisingly substantial stone church surrounded by a cluster of thatched cottages, and, on occasion, a fish pond. They were, in truth, little more than hamlets, these Shropshire villages that so intrigued Llewelyn, small islands scattered about the sea of plough-furrowed fields. But Llewelyn's people were pastoral, tribal, hunters and herdsmen rather than farmers, and these commonplace scenes of domestic English life were to him as exotic as they were unfamiliar. It was midday before he was within sight of the walls of Shrewsbury Castle. He drew rein, awed. Castle keep and soaring church spires, a fortified arched bridge spanning the River Severn, and the roofs of more houses than he could begin to count. He kept his distance, suddenly shy, and, after a time, he wheeled the gelding without a backward glance for the town he'd come so far to see. He did not go far, leaving the road to water his horse at Yokethal Brook. And it was there that he found the other boy. He looked to be about 9, as fair as Llewelyn was dark, with a thatch of bright hair the colour of sun-dried straw, and grass-green eyes that now focused admiringly upon Llewelyn's mount. Llewelyn slid to the ground, led the gelding forward with a grin that encouraged the other boy to say, in offhand manner, that Llewelyn was coming to recognise as the English equivalent of a compliment. "Is this horse yours?" "Yes," Llewelyn said, with pardonable pride. "He was foaled on a Sunday, so I called him Dydd Sul." The other boy hesitated. "You sound different," he said at last, and Llewelyn laughed. He'd been studying French for 3 years, but he had no illusion about his linguistic skills. "That is what Morgan, my tutor, says too," he said cheerfully. "I expect it is because French is not my native tongue." "You are not English, are you?" Llewelyn was momentarily puzzled, but then he remembered the people he thought of as English thought of themselves as Norman French, even though it had been more than 100 years since the Duke of Normandy had invaded and conquered England. The native-born English, the Saxons, had been totally subdued, unlike us, Llewelyn thought proudly. But he knew that the Normans had for the Saxons all the traditional scorn of the victors for the vanquished, and he hastened to say, "No, I am not Saxon. I was born in Gwynedd, Cymru, what you know as Wales." Green eyes widened. "I've never met a Welshman before," he said slowly, and it occurred to Llewelyn, just as he'd been raised on accounts of English treachery and tyranny, this boy was likely to have been put to bed at night with bloody tales of Welsh border raids. "I'll show you my cloven hoof, if you'll show me yours," he offered, and the other boy looked startled, and then laughed. "I am Llewelyn ap Iorwerth," unable to resist adding, "ap Owain Fawr." For Llewelyn was immensely proud that he was a grandson of Owain the Great, proud enough to disregard Morgan's oft-repeated admonition against such bragging. But the younger boy did not react, and Llewelyn realized with a distinct shock that the name meant nothing to him. He seemed to want to respond to Llewelyn's friendliness, but there was a certain wariness in his eyes. "I am Stephen de Hornay." He hesitated again. "You do not live in Shropshire, do you? I mean, if you are Welsh." The implication seemed clear. If he were Welsh, why was he not in Wales where he belonged? Llewelyn was more regretful than resentful. For his past fortnight he had been the loneliest of his life. "I'm staying at Caws Castle," he said coolly, and reached for Saul's reins. Caws Castle? The sudden animation of Stephen's voice took Llewelyn by surprise. "Lord Robert Corbeil's castle. You're living there?" Llewelyn nodded, bemused. "For now I am. My lady mother was wed a fortnight ago to Sir Hugh Corbeil, Robert's brother. You know them?" Stephen laughed. "Who in Shropshire does not know the Corbeil? They are great lords. My papa says they have more manners than a dog has fleas. In fact, he hopes to do homage to Lord Robert for the Corbeil Manor at Westbury." And he proceeded, unasked, to inform Llewelyn that he was the youngest son of Sir Odo de Hodnay, that the de Hodnays were vassals of Lord Fulk Fitzwarren, holding manors in Fitzwarren, at Moston and Wilbach, that he was the page in Fitzwarren's household at Alderbury Castle. Llewelyn was a little bit hazy about the intricacies of English land holding, but he did know that a vassal was a tenant of sorts, holding land in return for rendering his overlord 40 days of military service each year. And he was thus able to make some sense of this outpouring of names, places, and foreign phrases. What he could not at first understand was Stephen's sudden thawing, until he realized that the name Corbeil was his entry into Stephen's world. It was, he thought, rather like that story Morgan once told him, a tale brought back by the Crusades from the Holy Land, of a man who'd been able to gain access to a cave full of riches merely by saying the words, "Open Sesame." This realization gave Llewelyn no pleasure. It only reinforced his conviction that English values were beyond his understanding. How else explain that he should win acceptance, not for what truly mattered, his blood ties to Owain Fawr, the greatest of Welsh princes, but for a marriage that he felt should never have been? All at once he was caught up in a surge of homesickness, a yearning for Wales so overwhelming that he found himself blinking back tears. Stephen did not realize, and had not yet paused her breath. "And my papa says Caws is the strongest of all the border castles, that it could withstand a siege verily until Judgment Day. Tell me, is it true that Lord Robert has woven cloth on the floor of his bedchamber?" Llewelyn nodded. "It is called a carpet. Was brought back from the Holy Land." You could see that Stephen was on the verge of interrogating him at tiresome length about the subject that interested him not at all. And he said quickly, "But I know naught of castles, Stephen, nor do I like much living in one. We do not have them in my land, you see." Stephen looked incredulous. "None at all?" "Just those that were built by the Normans, Our people live in houses of timber, but they're scattered throughout the mountains, not all clustered together like your English villages." It was obviously a novel thought to Stephen, that not all cultures and societies were modelled after his own. They were both sitting on the bank by the stream, and he rolled over the grass, propped his chin in his hands, and said, "Tell me more about the Welsh." Llewelyn no longer had any reservation about boasting of his bloodlines. Stephen was so woefully ignorant that it was truly a charitable act to enlighten him. He decided and proceeded to acquaint Stephen with some of the more legendary exploits of his celebrated grandfather, giving his imagination free rein. "And so," he concluded, having at last run out of inspiration, "when my grandfather died, his sons fought to see who would succeed him. My father was deprived of his rightful inheritance, and Gwynedd is now ruled by my uncles, Rhodri and David." Welsh names were falling fast and free to Stephen's unfamiliar ears, much like the musical murmurings of Yochdol Brook. But one fact he'd grasped clearly. A prince is a prince, be he a Welsh or Norman. And he looked at Llewelyn with greatly increased respect. "Wait," he begged. "Let me be sure I do follow you. Your grandfather was a prince of Gwynedd, and your lady mother is a daughter of a prince of Powys, a Hared, daughter of Prince Madog ap Meredith. My father was killed when I was a babe, and there my mother wed Hugh Corbet. We live with her kin in Powys." Llewelyn had not begun talking until he was nearly 2, and since then his mother often teased. He seemed bound and determined to make up for all that lost time now. With so satisfactory an audience as Stephen, and a subject that was so close to his heart, he outdid himself, and Stephen learned that among the Welsh there was no greater sin than to deny hospitality to a traveller, that Welshmen scorned the chain-mail armour of the English knight, that Llewelyn's closest friends were boys named Rhys and Ednebydd, and the ancient Welsh name for Shrewsbury was Pengwern. The sun had taken on the dull red-gold haze of coming dusk, as Llewelyn obligingly gave Stephen a lesson in the basics of Welsh pronunciation. "Say Rhys like this, Rhys, and Ednebydd. Now try Griffith. It sounds like your Griffith. In Welsh, the double D is pronounced as TH. So my little brother's name is spelled A-D-D-A, but we say it as Eitha, Welsh for Adam." He paused, his head cocked. "Do you hear that? Someone is calling your name." Stephen scrambled to his feet so fast that he all but tumbled down the brook embankment. "My brother, Jesu, but he'll flay me alive." "Why?" "I coaxed him into taking me with him to Shrewsbury this morning. We agreed to meet at George Bridge, and I just forgot." "Well, cannot you say you are sorry?" And Stephen shook his head, staring at the boys now mounting the crest of the hill. "No, not with Walter. He's not much for forgiveness." The approaching boys looked to be about 14. The youngster in the lead had Stephen's butter-yellow hair. He strode up to Stephen and, without a word, struck the younger boy across the face with enough force to send Stephen sprawling. "We've been looking for you for nigh on 2 hours. I've a mind to leave you here, and damned well should." As Walter reached down and jerked Stephen to his feet, Llewelyn came forward. He'd taken an instant disliking to Walter de Hodner. But, for Stephen's sake, he sought to sound conciliatory as he said, "It was my fault, too. We were talking, and—" Walter's eyes flicked to his face, eyes bright blue, iced with sudden suspicion. "What sort of low-born riff-raff have you taken up with now, Stephen?" Llewelyn flushed. "I am Llewelyn ap Iorwerth," he said, after a long pause. Instinct was now alerting him to trouble. At the same time, Stephen burst into nervous speech.
He is a Welsh prince, Walter, and he's been telling me about Wales."
"Oh, he has," Walter said softly, and Stephen, who knew his brother well enough to be forewarned, tried to shrink back, but Walter still had a grip on his tunic. With his other hand he grasped a fistful of Stephen's hair and yanked, until Stephen's face was drawn back so far that he seemed to be staring skyward, and was whimpering in pain. "That's just what I could expect from you. No more common sense than the stupidest, sir. Not since the day you were born. So, he's been telling you about Wales. Did he tell you, too, about the crops burned in the fields, the villages plundered, the women carried off?" Releasing Stephen, he swung around and suddenly on Llewelyn. "Suppose you tell him about it now. Tell my lack-wit brother about the border raids. Tell him how brave your murdering countrymen are against defenceless peasants, and how they run like rabbits when we send men-at-arms against them." Sull was grazing some yards away, and for several moments Llewelyn had been measuring the distance, wanting nothing so much as to be up on that gelding's back, and off at breakneck run. But, with Walter's taunt, he froze where he was, pride temporarily prevailing over fear. He'd never run like a rabbit. Never. But there was a betraying huskiness in his voice as he said, "I have nothing to say to you." Walter was flanked by his two companions. They'd moved closer to Llewelyn, too close, and he took a backward step, but he dared retreat no farther, for the brook embankment was on his back, and he did not know how to swim. He stood very still, head held high, for he'd once seen a stray spaniel face down several larger dogs by showing no fear. They stepped in, tightening the circle, but made no move to touch him. He was never to know how long the impasse might have lasted, for at that moment one of the boys noticed Sull. "Damn me if he does not have his own mount. Where would a Welsh whelp get a horse like that?" "Where do you think?" Walter, too, was staring at the chestnut with frankly covetous eyes. "You know what they say. Scratch a Welshman, find a horse thief." Llewelyn felt a new and terrible fear, for he'd raised Sull from a spindle-legged fowl. Sull was his pride, his heart's passion. He forgot all else, grabbed at Walter's arm, as the older boy turned towards Sull. "He's mine, to me, you leave him be." It was a grievous mistake, and he paid dearly for it. They were on him at once, all three of them, and he went down in a welter of thudding fists and jabbing elbows. He flailed out wildly, desperately, but he could not match neither his assailants' strength nor their size, and soon he was pinned down in the trampled grass, Walter's knees on his chest, his mouth full of his own blood. "Misbegotten sons of Satan, the lot of you," Walter panted. "Blood bastards not worth the hanging." And if the profanity sat self-consciously on his lips, flaunting as tangible proof of passage into the mysteries of manhood. The venom in his voice was not affectation, was rooted in a bias that was ageless, breathed in from birth. "Know you what we mean to do now, Welsh rabbit? Pluck you as clean as a chicken." He reached out, tore the crucifix chain from Llewelyn's neck. "Spoils of war, starting with that chestnut horse you stole. You can damned well walk back to Wales, mother naked. And just thank your heathen gods that we did not hang you for a horse thief. Go on, Philip. I'll hold him whilst you get his boots." Sull. They were going to take Sull. His bruised ribs, his bloodied nose, hurt and humiliated in impotent fury. All of that was nothing now, not when balanced against the loss of Sull. Llewelyn gave a sudden frantic heave, caught Walter off guard and rolled free. But as quick as he was, the third boy was quicker, and before he could regain his feet, an arm had crooked around his neck, jerking him backward. And then Walter's fist buried itself in his midsection, and all fight went out of him. He lay, gasping for breath, as if drowning, in the very air he was struggling to draw into his lungs. "Walter, no!"
Stephen had last found his voice. "He's not a nobody. He's a highborn and kin to marry the Lord Corbet of Cowes. He's stepson to Hugh Corbet, Walter, and nephew of Lord Robert." Suddenly, all Llewelyn could hear was his own laboured breathing. Then one of the boys muttered, "Oh, Christ!" and that broke the spell. They all began to talk at once. "How do we know he's not lying?" "But, Walter, do you not remember? Lord Fulk was talking at dinner last week about Corbet's marriage to the Welshwoman, Frank, saying that Corbets hoped to safeguard their manors from Welsh raids with such a union. Will he go, whining to Corbet, do you think? Since you got us into this, Walter, you ought to be the one to put it right." After a low-voiced conference, they moved apart, and Walter walked back to Llewelyn. The younger boy was sitting up, wiping mud from his face and the sleeve of his tunic. He was bruised and scratched and sore, but his injuries were superficial. His rage, however, was all-consuming, blotting all sense from his brain. He raised slitted dark eyes to Walter's face. They glittered with hatred, made all the more intense by his inability to act upon it. "Here," Walter said tersely, dropping the crucifix on the ground at Llewelyn's feet. The conciliatory gesture was belied by the twist of his mouth, and when Llewelyn did not respond, he leaned over, grasped Llewelyn's arm with a roughness that was more honest indicator of his true feelings. "Come, I'll help you up." Walter's voice softened, took on a honeyed malice. "You need not be afraid," he drawled, and Llewelyn spat in his face. It was utterly unpremeditated, surprised Llewelyn almost as much as Walter, and he realized at once that his Corbet kinship would avail him little against an offence of such magnitude. But for the moment, the incredulous outrage in Walter's face was worth it, all worth it. Walter gasped and then lunged. Shock slowed his reflexes, however, and Llewelyn was already on his feet. He sprinted for Sull, and the gelding raised its head, expectant. For this was a game they had often played, and Llewelyn had become quite adept at vaulting onto his horse's back from a running jump. But as he chanced to glance over his shoulder, he saw he was not going to make it. Walter was closing ground with every stride. Llewelyn swerved, tripped, and sprawled face down in the high grass. There was no time for fear. It all happened too fast. Walter was on top of him, and this time the older boy was in deadly earnest. He meant to inflict pain, to maim, and his was the advantage of 4 years and full 40 pounds. "Walter, stop!" The other boys had reached them, were struggling to drag Walter off him. Llewelyn heard their voices as if from a great distance. There was a roaring in his ears. His right eye was swelling rapidly, and an open gash just above the eyelid was spurting so much blood that he was all but blinded. Through a spangled crimson haze he caught movement, and brought his arm up in a futile attempt to ward off the blow. But the expected explosion of pain did not come. Instead, the voices became louder, more strident. "Jesus God, Walter! Think what you do. Do you not hear your brother? The boy's not fair game. He's kin to the Corbet." "He's talking sense, Walter. You've got to let the boy be." "I intend to, as soon as he does beg my forgiveness." Walter was now straddling Llewelyn, holding the boy immobile with the weight of his own body. And he shifted his position as he spoke, driving his knee into Llewelyn's ribcage until he cried out in pain. "We're waiting on you. Tell me how sorry you are, and, whilst you be at it, let's hear you admit truth about your God-cursed kinfolk, that there's not a Welshman born who's not a thief and a cut-throat." Pain had vanquished pride. Llewelyn was frightened enough and hurting enough to humble himself with an apology, but it was unthinkable to do what Walter was demanding. "Care I avern." It was the worst oath Llewelyn knew, one that damned Walter to the fires of hell. The words were no sooner out of his mouth than his face was pressed down in the dirt and his arm twisted up behind his back. He'd been braced for pain, but not for this. Searing, burning, unendurable. The shouting had begun again. Walter's mouth was against his ear. "Say it," he hissed. "Say it, or by Christ I'll damned well break your arm." No, never. Did he say that aloud? Someone was grasping. Sorry. Surely not his voice. Welshman are thieves. No, not him. Again, louder this time. Enough, Walter. It was different when we did not know who he was. But Philip and I want no part of this. You do what you want with him, but we're going home, and straight away. The pain in his arm subsided, so slowly that Llewelyn did not at once realize he was free. Time passed. He was alone in the meadows now, but he did not move, not until he felt a wet muzzle on his back and his neck. It was Sul, nuzzling his tunic, playing their favourite game, seeking out hidden apple slices. Only then did tears well in Llewelyn's eyes. He welcomed them, needing to cry, needing the catharsis, the healing, but it was not to be. This was hurt beyond tears, and they trickled into the blood smearing his cheek, dried swiftly in the dying heat of the setting sun. Priding himself on his horsemanship, Llewelyn had never felt the lack of saddle before. Now, with his right arm all but useless, with no saddle pommel to grip, the once simple act of mounting was suddenly beyond his capabilities. Again and again he grasped Saul's mane, struggling to pull himself up on the gelding's back. Again and again he slid back, defeated. But Saul's placid temperament stood him in good stead. The chestnut did no more than roll its eyes sideways, as if seeking to understand this queer new game Llewelyn was set upon playing. And at last, sobbing with frustration, Llewelyn was able to put himself up on Saul's withers. He was promptly sick, clinging to Saul's mane while his stomach heaved and the sky whirled dizzily overhead, a surging tide of sunset colours spinning round and round like a child's pinwheel until the very horizon seemed a tilt and all the world out of focus. He headed the gelding back towards Couse Castle. He had nowhere else to go. Village life ceased at dusk, for only the wealthy could afford the luxury of candles and rushlight, and the little hamlets were deserted, his passage heralded only by the barking of dogs. It was well past nightfall by the time he was approaching Westbury. He had a hazy, half-formed hope that he might somehow sneak unseen onto the castle bailey, and then up into the keep, to the upper chamber where Robert Corbett's 3 young sons slept. How he was to accomplish this miracle feat, he had no idea, and it was rendered irrelevant now by the sudden appearance of a small body of horsemen. Llewelyn drew rein, for he'd recognized the lead rider, Hugh Corbett, his mother's new husband. "Llewelyn, where in the name of Jesus have you been, boy? Your mother's frantic, and little wonder. We've been out looking for you since Vespers." The search party carried lanterns, and as Hugh reined in beside Llewelyn, a glimmer of light fell across the boy's face. Only a flicker of illumination, but enough. Hugh drew in his breath sharply. "My God, lad, what happened to you?" There was some talk of summoning a doctor from Shrewsbury, but it was finally decided that Llewelyn's need was not so great as that. As a lady of the manor, Emma Corbett was, of necessity, a skilled apothecary. As adept in stitching up wounds, applying poultices, and brewing healing herbs as any physician. It was she who applied a salve of mutton fat and resin to Llewelyn's bruised ribs, bathed his swollen eye in rose water, and washed the blood and dirt from his face. "No, his shoulder was not dislocated," she said soothingly. "If it was, he'd be unable to move the arm at all." She did feel certain, though, that his wrist was sprained. See how it was swelling? She'd need cold compress for the eye, hot towels for the wrist, and her cachet of herbs, she directed, and her maid speedily departed the bedchamber, leaving Llewelyn alone with Emma Mariad, his mother. Voices sounded beyond the door. Llewelyn recognized one as his stepfather's. The other belonged to Robert Corbet, Hugh's elder brother. "Do not think you're making too much of this, Hugh. Boys will get into squabbles. Look at my Tom, how he—" "You have not seen him yet, Rob," Hugh said grimly, and pushed the door back. Robert Corbet, Baron of Cowes, was only 28, but he was decisive by nature, and long accustomed to the exercise of authority. At sight of Llewelyn, his face hardened. Kneeling by the boy, he said, "Who did this to you, lad?" Mahariad was standing behind her son. She reached out, let her hand rest on his shoulder. Emma shook her head, said, "It is no use, Rob. He's not said a blessed word for us so far. Mayhap if we left him alone with Hugh and Margaret." Llewelyn's head came up at that. "Her name is Mahariad. Mahariad, not Margaret." The words hovered on his lips. He bit them back with visible effort, and turned his face away, stayed stubbornly silent. Servants had carried bedding into the chamber, were spreading blankets down on the floor by the bed. And Hugh smiled at Llewelyn and said, "Margaret and I thought it would be best if you passed the night here with us. Now, why do we not see about getting you out of those grimed clothes?" Llewelyn rose obediently, let his stepfather strip off the bloody torn tunic, his shirt, chausses, and linen brace, the knee-length cowhide boots. But as Hugh pulled back the blanket and the boy slid under the covers, he said, very softly, yet very distinctly, "My mother's name is Mahariad." Hugh stood looking down at his stepson. He did not say anything, but Llewelyn had an unsettling suspicion that he understood all too well. Left alone at last, Llewelyn sought in vain to make himself comfortable on the impallet. He held the compress to his injured eye, tried not to think of anything at all. When the door opened, he did not look up, believing it to be his mother. But the footsteps were heavier, a man's tread. Llewelyn raised up awkwardly on his elbow, and his heart began to thud against his sore ribs, for it was Morgan. Mariad had been only 15 when Llewelyn was born, widowed by the following year, while pregnant with his brother, with Ava, small and frail and maimed. She was fiercely protective, but she tended from the first to treat her eldest son as if they were playfellows rather than mother and child. Llewelyn adored the dark, beautiful girl who teased him, laughed at his misdeeds, and taught him to view their troubles with light-hearted abandon. But it was Morgan who set the standards that structured his life. It was Morgan's approval that mattered. Instinctively he knew that his mother would forgive him any sin, no matter how great. Morgan would not, and that made his good opinion the more precious. He shrank now from revealing his shame to Morgan. That the youthful priest should look upon him with contempt was a greater punishment than any pain Walter de Hornay had inflicted. Morgan was carrying a platter. Setting it down, he tossed a cushion on the floor by Llewelyn's pallet, and spreading the skirt of his cassock as if it were a woman's gown, he settled himself beside the boy. "The Lady Emma has set up some broth, and your lady mother thought you might like a slice of seed cake." Llewelyn smiled wanly at that. His mother's invariable remedy for any childhood hurt was to offer sweets. Morgan leaned forward, spooned some broth into Llewelyn's mouth, and then turned the boy's head to the side, his eyes moving slowly over the bruises, contusions, and swellings. "You're likely to have a scar over that eye," he observed, dispassionately, and, not waiting for a response, fed Llewelyn another spoonful of soup. Putting the bowl aside, he turned towards the tray, handed Llewelyn a fresh compress. "Are you ready now to tell me about it?" Llewelyn flushed, shot Morgan a look of mute entreaty. But Morgan's grey eyes were unwavering, expectant. Llewelyn could not lie, not to Morgan. He swallowed, began to speak. Shrewsbury, Stephen, the meadow, Walter de Honey, his fear, and Welshmen are thieves. He held nothing of it back, spared himself nothing, but he could not meet Morgan's eyes, could not bear to see Morgan's dawning disgust. He looked instead at Morgan's hands, linked loosely in his lap. They were beautifully shaped, fingers long and supple, a symmetry marred only by the bitten gnawed nails, chewed down to the very quick, and an incongruous quirk in one with such disciplined nature. Llewelyn kept his gaze riveted on those hands, saw them flex, tense, and then slowly unclench. When Llewelyn had at last run out of words, one of the hands reached out, touched his hair in what seemed strangely like a caress. But Morgan's caresses were sparingly doled out, and surely would not be given now, not after what he just confessed. And yet the hand had not been withdrawn. It was brushing the hair back from his forehead, lingering. Morgan, bewildered, utterly at a loss. "I'm proud of you, lad." "Proud?" Llewelyn choked. "I shamed you, shamed us all. Did you not understand? I did what he demanded. I dishonoured my blood, grovelled before him." "And would you rather he'd broken your arm, mayhap maimed you for life?" "No, but listen to me, Llewelyn. Courage is a commendable quality, and a true test of manhood. You showed that today, and may rightly take pride in it. But for a prince of our people, courage alone is not enough. It must be tempered with common sense. You showed that too today, lad. Showed you were able to make a realistic recognition of superior strength. There's no shame in that, Llewelyn. None whatsoever. Be thankful rather that in a world full of fools, our Lord Saviour has blessed you with brains as well as boldness of spirit." "I was so ashamed," Llewelyn whispered, "not for the apology, but for the other, for saying my countrymen were thieves and cutthroats." "And does saying it make it so?" Morgan shook his head. "Do you know what the English say of us, Llewelyn? They say a Welshman's word is worth spit in the wind, and they are right, lad. An oath given to an enemy is made to be broken. We understand that. We use what weapons we have available to us, and when we fight on our terms, not theirs. These are lessons you must learn, Llewelyn, and learn well. The day will come when you will return to Gwynedd, lay claim to the lands your uncles now rule. You must be ready to win back what is yours, by right, and above all, to deal with the English. We are not a numerous people. For every Welshman born, the Lord God has seen fit to beget 20 of the English blood. Our princes have been forced to accept the English king as their liege lord, but we have not been subjugated as the Saxons were. We have not become a nation of serfs and bondsmen. These Norman lords who rule England, and would rule Wales if they could, hate us above all others. And still we live free, with our own princes, our own ways and customs." Llewelyn nodded eagerly, intent on a lesson he'd long ago learned. "This is because, when the English come to our lands," Morgan continued, "our people drive their livestock up into the hills, and then they hide themselves. The English burn our houses, but we are not bound to the land like the English peasants. When they withdraw, our people rebuild. Nor do we despair when we fight the English and find ourselves outnumbered. When we see ourselves losing, we retreat, and hit them again on the morrow. When they send armies to our land, we fade away into the woods, and they cannot find us. If you understand this, Llewelyn, you must understand too that you've no reason to reproach yourself, no reason to feel shame. It seemed nothing less than miraculous to Llewelyn that Morgan could heal the worst of his wounds with so little effort, and he gave the priest a grateful smile. Morgan pulled back and then said briskly, "Now, is it your wish that I tell the corbeil about this boy?" Llewelyn hesitated. Although he was feeling more and more comfortable about the role he played in that frightening encounter by Yorkville Brook, he still did not relish the prospect of confiding in his corbeil kin. "No," he said slowly. "No matter what they did to him, he'd just take it out on Stephen afterwards. I'd rather we let it lie, Morgan. For now," he added silently. "Walter de Haulnay, not a name to be forgotten." Morgan watched as Llewelyn touched his fingers to the puffy discoloured skin over his eye, to the swelling bruise high on his cheekbone, almost as if he were taking inventory of his injuries. And that, the priest knew, was precisely what the boy was doing, making a private acknowledgment of a debt due. Morgan sighed. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." On that, Holy Church spoke quite clearly, but as people parted company with their church on this issue, they did not believe in forgiving a wrong, forgetting an injury, ever. "Here," he said, handing Llewelyn a brimming goblet. "The Lady Emma mixed some bryony root in wine to ease your pain and help you sleep. Drink it down, and I'll stay with you till it takes effect. I have something of great importance to tell you. We learned this noon of the death, a death which will change the lives of us all." Llewelyn sat up. "Who, Morgan?" "Young Henry, the English king's eldest son and heir. We had word today that he died in France on the 11th of June of the bloody flux. He knew he was dying and pleaded with his father to come to him so they might reconcile ere he died. But Henry did not believe him, feared it was a trick. They are an accursed family, in truth the devil's brood." He shook his head, made the sign of the cross. "What will happen now, Morgan?" Ordinarily, the priest would have insisted that Llewelyn be the one to tell him that. But it was late, and the boy was bruised and sore, in no condition to be interrogated about lessons of history and statecraft. "You know, Llewelyn, that the English give all to the firstborn son. Since young Henry had no son of his own, the heir to the English throne is now his brother, Richard. So this means that Richard will one day be king." "That is not good for us, is it, Morgan? If Richard is as able a soldier as men say." "He is." Llewelyn swallowed some more wine. "I'm sorry Henry died," he said regretfully. "Since he was to be king one day, you made me learn as much as I could about him, and now all that effort goes for naught, and I've had to begin again with Richard." That triggered one of Morgan's rare laughs. "It is even worse than you know, lad. It is very likely that one of Richard's brothers might one day be king after him, so that means you must familiarize yourself with Geoffrey and John too." "All three? But why, Morgan? Richard will surely marry and beget a son. How then can Geoffrey or John ever be king?" Morgan did not respond at once, seemingly lost in thought. "Aye," he said at last. "I reckon you're old enough to know. I take it that your mother and her brothers have spoken to you of carnal matters, explaining how a woman gets with a child." "Of course. Mamma and my Uncle Griffith told me what I needed to know ages ago." A youngster growing up around livestock could not remain sheltered for long, and Llewellyns were uninhibited people, who viewed sex as a natural urge and a very enjoyable pleasure. Nor was theirs a society in which the stigma of illegitimacy carried much sting. Morgan was not surprised, therefore, by the boy's emphatic answer. Actually, Llewelyn knew far more about the carnal matters than Morgan suspected, for he knew about Gwenora. The average parish priest, be he Welsh or English or French, was not a well-educated man. Morgan was the exception. Most were simple villagers, and the burden of celibacy was one that not many could shoulder with equanimity. It was not at all uncommon for these lonely men to take to their hearts wives and live in concubines. And while the church officially decried these liaisons, they were tacitly accepted by most people and inevitable and even natural. Unlike so many of his fellow clerics, Morgan had never taken a wife or hearth-mate, and the occasions were few when he'd found his vow of chastity too onerous for mortal flesh. He was always quite discreet, and it was purely by chance that Llewelyn had found out about Gwenora. He had told no one, and would never have dreamed of saying a word to Morgan. It gave him a warm glow of pleasure to keep a secret for this man he so loved. "I know all about the carnal matters, Morgan," he said softly. "But what has it to do with one of Richard's brothers becoming king?" Morgan hesitated. "Richard is a brilliant battle commander, one of the best in Christendom. Nor, for all his tempers, is he an impious man. It is well known that he yearns to take the cross." "You mean go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land?" Morgan nodded, and then hesitated again. "However, the fact remains that Richard has been known to indulge in an unnatural vice. He would rather satisfy his lust with men than with women." Llewelyn's eyes widened. But how?" he blurted out, saw Morgan frown, and lapsed into a chastened silence. Men laying with other men. How was that possible? He'd seen enough animals mating to be able to envisage a coupling between a man and a woman, but when it came to coupling between men, his imagination failed him. "Morgan, do Richard's brothers share this sin?" "It is not hereditary vice, Llewelyn. Does not pass with the blood," Morgan said dryly. "Young Henry was happily wed, though childless. Geoffrey's sins are beyond counting, but he does confine those of the flesh to adultery. As for John, his wenching is notorious. As young as he is, he has at least one bastard, and seems destined for a life of debauchery and lechery." His mouth tightened. "They are not admirable men, lad, but one of them will one day be England's king, and your lives will be inexorably entwined, yours and his. Know thine enemy, Llewelyn. I can teach you no more valuable a lesson than that." "Lessons? At this time of night? Good God, Morgan, have you no mercy?" Mariad had come quietly into the room, laughing at Morgan. She bent over Llewelyn's pallet, enveloped him in a perfumed cloud. "Here, darling, I thought you should have a pillow tonight, and I brought you this." She opened her palm. "See, it's a coral paternoster. You put it under your pillow, and you will not be troubled by bad dreams." She began to adjust the covers, tucking him in, all the while keeping up a running commentary on his battle scars, telling him of fights his father had got into as a youngster. He had reached the age where he'd begun to shy away from caresses, and she confined herself to playful kiss on the tip of his nose, saying cheerfully, "Get some sleep now, sweetie, and when next there is a full moon, we'll go out by the moat to catch a frog. Then we'll draw a circle around it, throw a handful of salt about, and you whisper to the frog name the wretch that gave you those fearsome black eyes, and within a month he'll find himself covered with loathsome hairy warts." She got the response she was aiming for. Her son grinned, but as she straightened up, Morgan touched her elbow, drew her away from the pallet. "I do wish, madame," he murmured, "that you would refrain from filling the boy's head with such fanciful thoughts. Superstitions of that sort are rooted in pagan rites, having no place in Christian belief." Mariad laughed, unrepentant. "Do not be such a stick, Morgan." But then her amusement chilled, as if it had never been. The dark eyes narrowed, the full red mouth thinned noticeably. It was as if he were of a sudden looking at a different woman altogether. I want the names, Morgan. Names, madam? The names of the hellspawn who did it to my son, she hissed. I know he told you. He tells you everything. He does not want you to know, madam. It's better forgotten. Forgotten. That is my son, flesh of my flesh. I'll not let... Mama. They both turned back towards the bed. Mariette leaned down, smiled at her son. Are you not sleepy yet, sweetie? Yes. The day's trauma and the medicinal wine had loosened Llewelyn's tongue at last. Mama, I do hate it here. So does Abba. I'm so homesick, Mama. I miss Reese and Ed Nevitt and Uncle Griffith and... Llewelyn. Harriet sighs filled with tears. Please, Mama, can we not go back where I belong? Can we not go home? You will, lad, Morgan said quietly. I promise you that the day shall come when you will. Llewelyn stared up at him and then turned his head aside on the pillow. You mean we have to stay here for now? Yes, for now. Morgan stepped back, stood looking down at the boy. But you will go back to Wales, Llewelyn. You will go home.